He faked an alien autopsy and another guy buried a giant just to win an argument. Today, 33 dumb cover-up disasters somehow got even messier than the originals. We are talking forged diaries, fake fossils, and governments editing reality with a straight face. One scandal started with a taped door, and another ended with an orangutan jaw. Stay for 33, because this list somehow keeps getting more unbelievable the deeper it goes. The Piltdown Man Hoax. For 41 years, fake bones from rural Sussex warped humanity's story about its own origins. In 1912, Charles Dawson unveiled Piltdown Man after digging fragments near Piltdown, England. British scientists loved it because the skull seemed ancient, human, and conveniently very English. The cranium looked human, the jaw looked a pie-like, and that combination felt dramatically important. Arthur Smith Woodward backed Dawson, and museums treated the find like evolutionary treasure. Then more discoveries in Africa and Asia started making Piltdown look strangely out of place. In 1953, tests showed the skull was medieval, and the jaw came from an orangutan. Someone had filed the teeth, stained the bones, and basically dressed a fraud in geology. What looked like prehistory's missing link was really a handmade science trap with excellent timing. 2. The Hitler Diaries forgery. One of the biggest publishing embarrassments in modern Europe began with notebooks pretending to be Hitler's. In 1983, Stern magazine announced 60 volumes of Adolf Hitler's secret diaries in West Germany. The source was Konrad Kujau, a forger who sold Nazi memorabilia and loved theatrical deception. The notebooks were said to come from a wartime plane crash in East Germany. They even fooled respected historian Hugh Trevor Roper, at least briefly, before science walked in. Forensic tests found modern paper whiteners, newer ink compounds, and polyester threads inside bindings. That was awkward, because Hitler had died in 1945 and polyester had not cooperated. Kujau had aged pages with tea and grime, like a hobbyist cosplaying archival chemistry. The diaries collapsed almost instantly, and Stern learned that excitement is a terrible authentication method. 3. The donation of Constantine. For centuries, one forged document helped justify papal political power across huge parts of Europe. Medieval popes used it to support territorial claims, legal arguments, and very earthly ambitions. It sounded ancient, impressive, and conveniently useful to anyone sitting near the Vatican. Then in the 1440s, Italian scholar Lorenzo Valla examined the Latin with ruthless patience. He noticed words, legal phrases, and styles that belonged to a much later century. It was like finding Renaissance fingerprints all over a supposedly 4th century imperial proclamation. Valla's analysis showed the document was likely forged sometime around the 8th century. The church gradually stopped leaning on it, which says plenty without needing a trumpet. 4. The Dreyfus Affair frame-up. France tore itself apart because officials preferred protecting the army over admitting they framed a man. In 1894, Captain Alfred Dreyfus was convicted of treason in Paris and exiled. He was Jewish, ambitious, and politically convenient during a time of feverish nationalism. The case centered on a handwritten bordereau supposedly sent to the German military attaché. Problem was, the writing did not actually match Dreyfus in any convincing way. To patch that hole, Major Hubert Joseph Henry forged extra documents behind closed doors. Later, intelligence officer George Piquart realized the real suspect was Ferdinand Walsin. Instead of thanking Piquart, superiors pushed him aside and tried burying his discovery. The scandal exploded after Émile Zola intervened, and Dreyfus was finally exonerated years later. 5. The Teapot Dome bribery scandal. America's biggest political scandal before Watergate began with oil leases and a very obvious black bag. In the early 1920s, Interior Secretary Albert Fall secretly leased Navy oil reserves. The key sites were Teapot Dome in Wyoming and Elk Hills in California. Fall handed access to Harry Sinclair and Edward Doheny without competitive public bidding. Soon his New Mexico ranch suddenly improved, which tends to attract congressional curiosity. Money arrived through loans and gifts, including cash reportedly delivered in a little black bag. That detail made the whole thing feel less like governance and more like pulp fiction. Investigators followed the money, exposed the bribes, and crushed Fall's respectable public image. In 1931, he became the first cabinet member imprisoned for crimes committed in office. 6. The U-2 spy plane cover story. A Cold War lie collapsed because Washington assumed the pilot was dead and silent. On May 1, 1960, the Soviet Union shot down Francis Gary Powers' U-2. The aircraft had been flying deep over Soviet territory, gathering photographic intelligence. The Eisenhower administration quickly announced a harmless NASA weather plane had wandered off course. Officials described oxygen trouble, pilot confusion, and an innocent scientific mission gone wrong. Then Nikita Khrushchev let the Americans keep talking before springing his favorite surprise. The Soviets had the wreckage, the cameras, and Powers alive in custody. That meant the entire cover story detonated on the world stage in real time. The embarrassment wrecked a major summit and turned a secret flight into public humiliation. 7. The Bay of Pigs, fake Cuban bombers. A covert invasion looked less covert when the fake airplanes got the details embarrassingly wrong. In April 1961, the CIA backed Cuban exiles landing at the Bay of Pigs. To deny American involvement, planners disguised B-26 bombers as Cuban Air Force aircraft. They painted markings, copied numbers, and tried building a neat little visual alibi. Unfortunately, the noses were wrong because the CIA used a different B-26 variant. Cuban planes had transparent noses, while these carried solid metal noses too obvious to ignore. Adlai Stevenson defended the story internationally, while journalists noticed the mismatch almost immediately. Then the invasion collapsed within days, leaving Washington with failure and a broken costume. It was like wearing a fake mustache while forgetting your actual name tag. 8. The 18.5-minute Nixon tape gap. 17 presidents' worth of excuses could not stretch across an 18.5-minute silence. During Watergate in 1973, investigators learned Richard Nixon recorded conversations inside the White House. One crucial June 20, 1972 tape contained a missing 18.5-minute section. Rosemary Woods, Nixon's secretary, said she accidentally erased it while answering the telephone. To demonstrate, she recreated the pose now remembered as the Rosemary stretch. Her body twisted across desk, chair, and pedal like office furniture had become gymnastics equipment. Experts later concluded the gap required several separate erasures, not one clumsy accident. That turned a strange missing section into one of the most famous non-explanations ever offered. The silence became louder than the recording, and nobody credible bought the performance. 9. The Chernobyl silence. A nuclear disaster crossed borders before Soviet officials even admitted the explosion had happened. On April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 exploded at the Chernobyl plant in Soviet Ukraine. Firefighters rushed in without understanding the radiation pouring from the shattered core. Pripyat stayed active for hours, with residents watching the glow like accidental spectators. Moscow issued no immediate warning, no public statement, and no neighboring alert. The cover broke only after workers at Forsmark in Sweden triggered radiation alarms. At first, Swedish staff feared their own plant was leaking something catastrophic. Then scientists traced the contamination outward and pointed directly toward the Soviet Union. Only then did officials acknowledge the disaster, by which time the fallout was already international. 10. The Kyshtym disaster cover-up. An enormous Soviet nuclear accident stayed hidden so long that maps were quietly edited around it. On September 29, 1957, waste exploded at the Mayak complex near Kyshtym. The blast contaminated huge areas of the southern Urals with dangerous radioactive material. Villages were evacuated in secrecy, often with little explanation beyond vague state orders. Instead of acknowledging disaster, officials scrubbed settlements from maps and censored everything. Later, the contaminated zone became the East Ural Nature Reserve, which sounds peaceful. It was really a radioactive exclusion area rebranded with the soothing language of conservation. People outside the Soviet Union learned details much later, after exiled sources spoke publicly. Turning contamination into a pretend wildlife story is dark, cynical, and weirdly bureaucratic. 11. The Soviet photo erasures. Under Stalin, disappearing from public life often meant disappearing from photographs with suspiciously bad editing. When officials fell from favor, Soviet retouchers removed them from official images and publications. Nikolai Yezhov became one of the most famous examples after his execution in 1940. Earlier photos showed him beside Stalin near the Moscow-Volga Canal with perfect clarity. Later versions simply erased Yezhov, leaving Stalin alone beside strangely altered water and shadows. Other edited images forgot sleeves, hands, hats, or odd empty spaces around surviving figures. The goal was simple: reshape memory until old alliances looked like hallucinations. But every careless retouch left clues, and historians now compare versions like crime scenes. The regime wanted perfect control and accidentally created a museum of visual guilt. 12. The Baghdad Bob Denial Campaign. Few public denials have aged faster than claiming tanks were nowhere nearby while tanks rolled nearby. In April 2003, Iraqi Information Minister Mohammed Saeed Sahaf faced cameras in Baghdad. English-language audiences nicknamed him Baghdad Bob because his certainty felt almost superhuman. He declared American forces were not entering the capital and were being crushed. Meanwhile, U.S. armored units were already approaching and sometimes visibly present behind him. Reporters stood there hearing explosions and engines while he kept reciting confidence like scripture. That contrast made each briefing feel less like news and more like surreal comedy. He never seemed rattled, which somehow made the whole spectacle even stranger. Baghdad Bob became a symbol of denial so extreme it looped into performance art. 13. The Rosemary Wood Stretch. One secretary's attempt to explain erased evidence turned office ergonomics into national entertainment. In November 1973, Rosemary Woods showed reporters how she supposedly erased Nixon's tape accidentally. She remained seated while twisting toward a phone far behind her desk. At the same time, she claimed her foot stayed pressed on the transcription pedal. Photographers captured the pose, and it looked physically implausible even before technical analysis. Her explanation concerned the famous 18.5-minute Watergate gap on a key recording. Experts later said multiple deliberate erasures caused the missing section, not one accidental reach. So Woods accidentally created a second scandal inside the first scandal's smoking crater. The phrase Rosemary Stretch survived because the image was simply too absurd to forget. 14. The Watergate break-in cover-up. A tiny piece of tape on a door latch helped topple an American president. Late on June 17, 1972, guard Frank Wills noticed tape blocking a basement lock. He removed it, continued his rounds, then returned and found the latch taped again. That second strip told him somebody inside really wanted a quiet entrance. Police caught 5 burglars inside Democratic National Committee offices with cameras and wiretap equipment. The men were linked to operatives working for Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. What followed included hush money, pressure on investigators, and frantic efforts to contain damage. The burglary alone was bad, but the cover-up dragged the entire presidency down. Sometimes history changes because one observant night guard refuses to ignore something weird. 15. The Volkswagen Dieselgate scam. Volkswagen lost billions because its clean diesel miracle was basically software wearing a fake mustache. For years, VW marketed diesel cars as efficient, modern, and environmentally responsible. Inside the vehicles, engineers installed defeat device software that recognized emissions testing conditions. During lab tests, pollution controls switched fully on and numbers looked impressively compliant. On real roads, those controls reduced or shut off, and emissions shot upward. Researchers at West Virginia University noticed the gap during road testing in 2014. Their findings pushed regulators deeper, and the elegant green marketing story began cracking. By 2015, the cheating became global news involving around 11 million vehicles. The scandal cost Volkswagen staggering sums and proved code can lie as smoothly as advertisements. 16. Theranos and the Edison machine lie. Billions of dollars chased a medical revolution that mostly worked only during presentations. Elizabeth Holmes founded Theranos in 2003 and promised tiny blood samples could transform testing. The company's signature device, called Edison, supposedly ran hundreds of analyses from finger pricks. Investors loved the pitch, especially with Holmes wearing black turtlenecks and channeling Steve Jobs. Inside the labs, though, the machines often failed or handled only limited tests. So Theranos secretly used conventional analyzers from companies like Siemens behind the scenes. Employees were told to keep those machines hidden during visits from partners and investors. Patients received unreliable results, while the startup kept selling a future it had not built. Once whistleblowers spoke and documents surfaced, the sleek myth collapsed with terrifying speed. 17. The Enron Star Wars shell companies. Enron hid massive debt inside fake entities and somehow still found time for nerdy naming jokes. Before collapsing in 2001, Enron used off-books partnerships to disguise losses and inflate profits. Executives such as Andrew Fastow structured shell companies that kept toxic liabilities out of sight. Some names sounded like a fan convention had wandered into corporate fraud. There was Chuco, echoing Chewbacca, and Jedi, meaning Joint Energy Development Investments. Those goofy labels masked serious manipulation affecting pensions, investors, and the company's public image. As investigations deepened, the complex structures started looking less brilliant and more desperate. The accounting fog lifted, and Enron's celebrated success turned into corporate wreckage almost overnight. It is hard to call yourself a visionary when your empire collapses like a badly rendered spaceship. 18. The John Edwards paternity lie. A presidential campaign imploded because one aide agreed to tell a lie too enormous to survive. In 2007 and 2008, John Edwards hid an affair with videographer Riel Hunter. Hunter became pregnant while Edwards still campaigned as a polished family man after his wife's illness. To conceal the child, aide Andrew Young publicly claimed he was the father. Young was married, had children, and still stepped forward carrying that absurd cover story. Meanwhile, wealthy supporters secretly moved money around to support Hunter and keep her hidden. The arrangement lasted until Young broke ranks and described what had really happened. Edwards eventually admitted paternity, turning a national campaign into a soap opera with subpoenas. It was not just immoral, it was logistically insane and doomed from the beginning. 19. Anthony Weiner's hacked account defense. One mistaken click turned a congressman's private scandal into public comedy with a 7-day delay. Instead, the photo appeared publicly for thousands of followers to examine immediately. Weiner then claimed his account had been hacked, and uncertainty clouded the image. He gave interviews, looked serious, and kept stretching the explanation past common sense. The internet, unfortunately for him, had screenshots, timestamps, and an appetite for obvious nonsense. For more than a week, he defended a story collapsing under its own weight. Then he admitted the photo was his, and the hacking claim was false. His political career was wrecked by one digital slip, followed by several unnecessary extra ones. 20. Jussie Smollett's staged attack. A carefully staged story unraveled because the paper trail was somehow less subtle than the plot. In January 2019, Jussie Smollett reported a racist and homophobic attack in Chicago. The story drew national attention, outrage, and immediate sympathy from many public figures. Then, investigators reviewed surveillance, phone records, and Smollett's ties to the Osundairo brothers. Those brothers had worked with him before and were traced through travel and communication records. Most damaging of all, Smollett had paid them with a personal check. That detail turned a dramatic allegation into a courtroom disaster with receipts attached. By the end, the strange late-night story looked less like chaos and more like casting. 21. Milli Vanilli's lip-sync fraud. A chart-topping pop act lost its Grammy because the voices on the records were not theirs. In the late 1980s, Rob Pilatus and Fab Morvan became global stars as Milli Vanilli. Their songs dominated radio, MTV, and magazines, all wrapped in polished dance pop confidence. Producer Frank Farian had actually used other singers for the studio vocals. The illusion held until a 1989 performance at Lake Compounce in Connecticut. During the show, the track began repeating the same lyric over and over. Rob and Fab were left on stage while the recording exposed the trick in real time. They ran off, and the group's entire image started collapsing in public view. Soon the Grammy vanished too, proving fame sounds different when someone else sang it. 22. The Cardiff Giant Hoax. An atheist with a grudge buried a fake giant and accidentally created one of America's wildest attractions. In 1869, George Hull secretly placed a carved gypsum giant on his cousin's land. That land belonged to William Newell in Cardiff, New York, near Syracuse. A year later, workers digging a well discovered the 10-foot figure underground. Crowds poured in, paying to see what many called a petrified ancient giant. Experts debated whether it was real, while newspapers helped fan the spectacle. Hull had financed the carving after arguing with a minister about biblical giants. Then P.T. Barnum built his own copy and insisted his fake was authentic. America briefly hosted a fake giant, and then a fake of that fake. 23. The Cottingley Fairies fraud. Paper cutouts and hat pins fooled serious adults because people badly wanted magic to photograph well. In 1917, cousins Elsie Wright and Frances Griffiths took pictures in Cottingley, England. The photos showed them beside tiny dancing fairies in a garden setting. To many viewers, the images looked whimsical, impossible, and somehow strangely persuasive. Arthur Conan Doyle embraced them enthusiastically while exploring spiritualism after the First World War. That gave the fairy photos prestige, publicity, and a much larger believing audience. The trick was wonderfully low-tech, cardboard figures drawn by Elsie and pinned upright. The girls maintained the secret for decades before admitting the hoax in 1983. A detective novelist creator got duped by stationery, sunlight, and the child's patience. 24. The Alien Autopsy Film Scan. Millions watched doctors dissect a supposed extraterrestrial body that turned out to be shop floor theater. In 1995, producer Ray Santilli promoted film allegedly showing an alien autopsy from Roswell. The footage looked grainy, black and white, and exactly mysterious enough to tempt believers. Television audiences devoured it because the timing was perfect for UFO obsession. Skeptics then began noticing props, procedures, and room details that felt suspiciously modern. One especially damaging clue was a telephone cord inconsistent with a 1947 setting. That detail suggested the secret military lab looked more like a late 20th century set. In 2006, Santilli admitted the film was staged, while still adding murky caveats. Even the confession tried keeping one foot inside the mystery, which somehow fits perfectly. 25. The Beringer Fake Fossils. A respected professor published fake fossils because rivals turned academic jealousy into geological trolling. In 1725, Johann Beringer began finding remarkable limestone specimens near Würzburg in Bavaria. They showed lizards, birds, spiders, and even symbols that looked almost cosmically decorative. Beringer believed the stones revealed divine artistry inside nature's ancient layers. He collected them, studied them, and proudly published a lavish book about them. The problem was that colleagues Johann Ignaz Roderick and Georg von Eckhart had planted them. They had secretly carved the stones and scattered them along Beringer's usual routes. A specimen bearing Beringer's own name should have ended the madness immediately. Instead, he published that too, and the scandal detonated in court afterward. 26. The Howard Hughes Mormon Will Forgery. A handwritten will promising millions collapsed because even fake documents need to spell things correctly. After Howard Hughes died in 1976, claimants emerged around his gigantic, unsettled estate. One document surfaced from Melvin Dumar, a gas station owner from Utah. Dumar said he once rescued a ragged stranger who later proved to be Hughes. According to the will, Hughes rewarded him with a vast portion of his fortune. It sounded cinematic, lonely, and weirdly tailored for a future movie adaptation. Forensic experts examined the handwriting and found major problems almost immediately. Most embarrassingly, the document misspelled Hughes's own business name in a key place. Courts rejected it, and the legend survived mostly because the story was so absurdly specific. 27. The Salem witch trials blame shift. 20 people died because invisible evidence suddenly counted until authorities needed someone else to blame. In 1692, panic spread through Salem, Massachusetts, as accusations of witchcraft spiraled outward. Girls reported torments, neighbors repeated suspicions, and courts accepted spectral evidence as meaningful. That meant someone could be condemned because another person claimed seeing their spirit. No physical proof was necessary, which is terrifying once you say it slowly. When doubt finally grew, judges faced an ugly question about their own responsibility. Their answer was breathtaking. The devil had impersonated innocent people and tricked the court. So the legal system basically blamed Satan for misleading the legal system. In a world, Governor William Phips halted proceedings, but apologies came long after the executions were irreversible. 28. The CIA's MKUltra secrecy. For years, the CIA ran mind control experiments, so secretive even many insiders barely understood them. Beginning in 1953, MKUltra explored interrogation methods using drugs, hypnosis, and psychological manipulation. The program operated during intense Cold War fear about brainwashing and Soviet methods. Some tests involved LSD, often given without informed consent to unwitting subjects. Safe houses in San Francisco and elsewhere were used in bizarre monitoring setups. Agency chemist Sidney Gottlieb oversaw much of the project under extreme secrecy. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered many MKUltra records destroyed. That shredding job might have buried everything if a cache of financial files had not survived. What emerged later was not science fiction but a paper-thin line between espionage and abuse. 29. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study Cover-Up. Hundreds of black men were denied proper treatment while officials watched disease unfold for decades. Starting in 1932, researchers in Tuskegee, Alabama followed men with syphilis without informed consent. They were told they were receiving care for bad blood, a vague local term. Even after penicillin became accepted treatment in the 1940s, the study continued. Doctors tracked damage rather than stopping it, which is cruelty wearing a lab coat. The men were blocked from learning the truth and often from receiving outside treatment. Families suffered too because wives and children were exposed to preventable harm. Public outrage exploded only after the study became widely known in 1972. The scandal permanently changed research ethics because the human betrayal was simply impossible to ignore. 30. The Iran-Contra destruction of evidence. A White House scandal deepened because key players treated shredders like emergency constitutional advisors. In the mid-1980s, officials secretly sold arms to Iran despite stated public restrictions. Profits were diverted to the Contra rebels in Nicaragua despite congressional limits. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North became one of the most recognizable faces of the affair. When investigations tightened, documents vanished, notes were altered, and frantic destruction followed. North's secretary, Von Hall, famously described helping move and shred sensitive paperwork. That image alone made the operation feel like covert policy meeting office panic room. The scheme mixed diplomacy, proxy war, and improvisation in almost reckless proportions. Even after hearings, the leftover confusion showed how secrecy multiplies once paper starts disappearing. 31. The Pentagon Papers Deception. A Secret History of Vietnam revealed how several administrations privately doubted what they publicly sold. The Pentagon Papers were a classified study tracing U.S. decisions in Vietnam from 1945. The documents showed officials expanding commitments while hiding doubts, failures, and internal contradictions. Presidents from Truman through Johnson appeared in a far harsher light than speeches suggested. Soon the issue became not just Vietnam, but government credibility itself. When leaders spend years varnishing failure, the unvarnished archive hits like a hammer. 32. The Challenger Disaster, PR Cover-Up. 7 astronauts died, and the first official story blurred how many warnings had already been raised. On January 28, 1986, Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after launch. Millions watched live because teacher Krista McAuliffe was on board, making the mission unusually visible. Cold Florida temperatures had worried engineers about the shuttle's O-ring seals before liftoff. At Morton Thiokol, some engineers argued against launching under those freezing morning conditions. Management discussions, schedule pressure, and institutional momentum pushed the decision the other way. After the disaster, early public messaging softened how clear those pre-launch concerns had been. The Rogers Commission later exposed a culture where warning signals were normalized and minimized. It was not one sudden mystery, but a chain of ignored red flags. 33. The Hillsborough Disaster Blame Campaign. 97 Liverpool supporters died, and authorities spent years pushing blame toward the victims themselves. On April 15, 1989, overcrowding at Hillsborough Stadium caused a fatal crush during an FA Cup semi-final. Supporters were trapped against perimeter fences in pens already dangerously full. Immediate police failures around crowd control and access were central to what happened. Yet early narratives emphasized drunken fans, late arrivals, and supposed unruly behavior. Some police statements were altered before review, trimming criticism of command decisions. Certain newspapers amplified false claims about theft, violence, and abuse by the dead and injured. Families fought for decades against institutional resistance, delay, and defensive official storytelling. The later inquests shattered the blame campaign and restored truth piece by painful piece.